Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Wednesday, August 7th, 2024. This is The Excerpt. Today, Harris has unveiled her running mate, plus an Iran-linked plotter who may have targeted Donald Trump has been arrested. And we talk about new findings surrounding small, ancient cousins of humans. Vice President Kamala Harris introduced Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate during a rally in Philadelphia yesterday evening, and Walz used the opportunity to immediately go after former President Donald Trump.
Donald Trump sees the world a little differently than us. First of all, he doesn't know the first thing about service. He doesn't have time for it because he's too busy serving himself.
Walz also issued a debate challenge to his Republican opponent, Senator J.D. Vance. For his part, Trump did not immediately issue a statement on Walz's selection, though he did criticize him in a text to donors. Trump also said he'll be doing an interview with Elon Musk on Monday. But for more on the latest running mate to enter this year's race, my colleague Dana Taylor spoke with USA Today White House correspondent Joey Garrison.
Joey, thanks for hopping on The Excerpt.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
What should we know about Tim Walz? Tell us about his background.
The background and the biography of Tim Walz is one of the things that really attracted Kamala Harris to make him her vice presidential pick. They very much see him as sort of the common man, Midwest roots. He spent 24 years in the National Guard, was a high school teacher and football coach, served in Congress where he represented a district that would vote for Donald Trump at one point in 2016. And so they believe he has crossover to rural voters. Then he became elected governor a couple of years ago. And in that role, he's really pushed a progressive record on a number of issues whilst still maintaining his core values to working class voters and rural voters. So I think it was that mix and that possibility that he can be a big messenger in key Midwest battleground states that ultimately gave him the nod over other contenders.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because she had lots of options, what factored into this decision for the Harris campaign?
Well, so I think in the end it came down, as has been widely reported, between Tim Walz of Minnesota, ultimately the pick, and Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. Now, Shapiro was appealing for several reasons. He's one of the real talented kind of young crop of governors out there for Democrats, but also wildly popular in Pennsylvania, which really, I mean, if you look at the electoral map, that's the most important state for Democrats to win. Really, any pathway towards a victory runs through Pennsylvania. But there were some concerns aired about him from progressives. There were concerns about what his policy with Israel would be in the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. He's also taken some very conservative stances, namely Shapiro supports school vouchers that, of course, allow public money to go towards private schools. That's something that Democrats historically don't support. So he would have rubbed unions, teachers' unions, others the wrong way. Shapiro ended up being a riskier possibility for VP than I think Walz was. Really, anyone you talk to has nice things to say about Walz as a person. And again, this ability for him to be the messenger, I think, on prosecuting the case against Trump really weighed heavily on Harris. It was Walz, after all, who has coined this new attack line against Trump and Vance that they are, quote, weird. That's kind of taken off. It's almost in a shift of framing the race so dramatically like Biden did with democracy being at stake. Instead, he's tried to say, hey, look, these people on the right, these Trump Republicans are just a bunch of weirdos with their policy. And that's something that's kind of caught fire.
Joy, we know that the VP pick will potentially be one heartbeat away. I'm not minimizing that. But in terms of winning a presidential election, how important is a candidate's VP pick?
Well, I think most studies show it's ultimately not the most important factor. Maybe it could skew a race by half percentage point to a point. But I do think, I mentioned Pennsylvania, but also Wisconsin and Michigan. Those are states really that Harris needs to desperately win in order to win this race. And if he can make Harris more appealing to a lot of blue-collar voters, these are voters who have drifted over to the Republican side towards Trump in recent elections. And that's how Trump has really ran up the score in a lot of these rural counties. If Walz can help limit that and just allow Harris to do a little bit better among these voters, then that can go a long way in winning some of these states.
As we've mentioned, Tim Walz is the governor of Minnesota, which is not a swing state. What does this pick do for the Democrats?
The ticket of Harris and Walz are going to go to Michigan, Wisconsin. You're going to see him deployed over and over in those crucial states, trying to articulate this message. He's going to blast Trump is wanting to support the corporations and the wealthiest Americans with tax cuts. And he's going to position himself with Harris as the candidates for the working class and then fighting for the middle class. And that's what he brings to the ticket.
Really appreciate your insights here, Joey. Joey Garrison is a White House correspondent for USA Today.
Hey, thanks so much.
A Pakistani national with ties to Iran who may have targeted Donald Trump has been charged with murder for hire as part of a plot to assassinate a U.S. politician or government official, potentially in response to the Trump administration's 2020 killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. That's according to a criminal complaint unsealed yesterday. Asif Merchant arrived in the U.S. around April and contacted a person he believed could help him carry out the scheme, the Department of Justice alleged. But that person told law enforcement about Merchant's plans and became a confidential source. The charges came weeks after an attempted assassination of Trump at a Pennsylvania political rally, but a law enforcement official said investigators so far have not uncovered evidence linking Merchant to the Pennsylvania attack by 20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks. For the first time in 40 years, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has taken emergency action to suspend the use of a pesticide found to cause irreversible damage to fetuses when they're exposed in utero. The pesticide, known as DCPA or Dacthal, has been linked to low birth weight babies who later in life have been shown to have decreased IQ and impaired brain development and motor skills. Michael Friedhoff, assistant administrator for the EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, said in a statement yesterday, quote, DCPA is so dangerous that it needs to be removed from the market immediately, unquote. According to an EPA report, the pesticide was first introduced in 1958 to control weeds in agricultural and non-agricultural settings, primarily for crops like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and onions. Following 3 days of losses, including Monday's sell-off, the three major U.S. indexes regained ground yesterday. The tech-heavy NASDAQ and S&P 500 rose just over 1%, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average improved around 0.75 of a percentage point. The economic news that dented investor confidence came Friday when the Department of Labor reported the U.S. economy created fewer jobs in July than expected, and the unemployment rate rose to 4.3%. The unemployment rate has ticked up in every month of 2024 except February. Still, the economy created jobs in July, and the jobless rate remains historically low. You can read more about those complicated factors and whether last week's job numbers raise the risk of a recession with a link in today's show notes. Ancient hobbits were even smaller than previously thought. I spoke with USA Today national correspondent Elizabeth Weiss to learn more. Beth, thanks for hopping on.
Happy to be here as always.
So this sounds like something out of Middle-earth, but it's not from a Tolkien novel. What were these hobbit-like species that were cousins to modern humans? What do the fossils tell us?
This species is called Homo floresiensis, which means the people who live on the island of Flores. And it's why we call them hobbits, because it is hard to say. Like, I can handle Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis, but this one is hard. So anyway, so these hobbits, what we think happened was 1.1 million years ago, Homo erectus, which was the upright man, a human species of which there have been many, we're the only ones left, Homo sapiens. So these Homo erectus beings lived on Java in what is now Indonesia, and some of them got over to the island of Flores, which is across like 6 or 7 miles of really gnarly ocean water, so not an easy place to get. And they stayed there and nobody else came. And what happens in island species, and we know this because there's multiple examples. If you are a largish animal that ends up on an island and you have no major predators, so you got nothing that requires you to stay big and strong, you will shrink. Like it's happened with elephants or mastodons, which are a precursor to elephants, with deer, with cattle, a lot of different species, because there's no evolutionary pressure to stay big if there's nothing that you have to fight off. There's a lot of evolutionary pressure to get smaller because you require less food and you can reproduce easier. And so what they think happened is Homo erectus somehow got over to Flores, which is an island like the size of Puerto Rico. And there were Komodo dragons and these big flightless birds, but not things that would actually go out of their way to eat people. And so they just got smaller and smaller and smaller until they ended up about 3 feet high, which is why they're called hobbits in the popular press. And they seem to have lived on this island for about 500,000 years. And then they disappeared about 50,000 years ago, which plus or minus a few thousand years is about when Homo sapiens started to show up in the area. So did we have a role in making them disappear or not? We don't know.
Well, I wanted to get to that exact question. I mean, we notice that these archaic humans are not roaming the world with us nowadays, Beth. So is that really kind of the working theory, that they didn't have big predators for a long time, but then modern humans come through and kind of push them out?
Well, when you talk to scientists of any stripe, but especially paleontologists and anthropologists, they're like, well, we can't possibly know. And, how could we ever know? But there's a fair amount of evidence. I mean, Homo sapiens are very smart. We can be very aggressive. We can be pretty warlike, as you can notice just by looking at the news. Everywhere we popped up that there were other human species living, you will note those other human species are now gone. So it's kind of a draw your own conclusions.
So I'm curious about, what can we learn really by studying early human fossils in this way? Why is this work so important?
When I was a kid, you kind of grew up and you're like, oh yeah, there were like cavemen and then there were people and that's kind of how it went. And now we're finding out that there were all these other human species floating around the planet. I mean, not just the Neanderthals, but the Desnovians and the hobbits. And we can see how evolution played out. So what this paper found is, so the first fossils were found from these people. They were about 100 to 60,000 years ago. But nearby, like 85 miles away on the same island, they found fossils that go back 700,000 years ago. And these were relatively intelligent beings. I mean, they weren't Homo sapiens, but they probably had fire. They seem to have made stone tools. And who knows, would they have evolved into something more intelligent? We don't know. And the fossils that they're writing about in this paper are ones that are much older than the first group they found. I mean, so these are 700,000 years ago. They may even have gotten a little tiny bit smaller in that first 300,000 years they were on the island. And then they might have gotten a little bit larger. But if you see the reconstructions on their skulls, they look human-like. And, they were 3 feet tall, the adults, and their stocking feet wandering around this island making stone tools. It's fascinating to think of all the different types of humans that have been on the planet.
It's absolutely fascinating. And folks, if they're curious, can find a picture in your piece, Beth, with a link in today's show notes. Elizabeth Weiss, a national correspondent with USA Today. Thank you, Beth.
Thanks so much.
Nancy Pelosi has been the most powerful woman in American history. She was the first female Speaker of the House and remains an influential advisor to presidents, including Joe Biden in recent weeks. She was instrumental in passing everything from the 2008 financial bailout to the Affordable Care Act. But in her new book, The Art of Power, Pelosi starts out not with a legislative triumph, but with a personal tragedy, when her husband was brutally attacked by an intruder who was searching for her. USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page recently sat down with Pelosi to talk about what the book meant to her. You can hear part of that conversation with a special episode of The Excerpt later today, right here on this feed. You can find the episode after 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your pods, and if you're on a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. I'm Taylor Wilson, back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.